Harlem settles differently after midnight. The noise does not disappear, it softens. Sirens become distant echoes, conversations drop to murmurs, and the glow of streetlights paints long shadows across cracked sidewalks. In the late 1980s, this quiet hour belonged to stories. Stories whispered between hustlers leaning against brick walls, between mothers looking out apartment windows, between young men who dreamed of escape and older men who knew how rare it truly was. And among those stories, one name carried a particular weight, spoken with a mix of admiration, envy, and disbelief. Rich Porter. Before the headlines, before the rumors of betrayal and bloodshed, Rich Porter existed as something almost unreal to the streets of Harlem. He was not loud. He was not reckless. He did not need to announce himself. His presence alone did that. In a neighborhood shaped by scarcity, where survival demanded constant motion, Rich Porter moved with calm purpose, as if the chaos around him bent slightly to accommodate his path. People noticed that. They remembered it. At night, when the city exhaled, his legend grew larger than his physical form. Some said he was a genius with numbers. Others said he had a gift for reading people, knowing who could be trusted and who could not long before danger revealed itself. To many, he represented something dangerously close to hope, the idea that someone from these same blocks could rise above the daily grind and touch a version of success that felt untouchable. That belief, more than money, made him powerful. The Harlem of 1987 was a place of contradiction. Beauty and decay lived side by side. Brownstones that once symbolized elegance now carried scars of neglect. Music poured from car windows, blending soul, hip-hop, and ambition into a soundtrack that pulsed through the streets day and night. Yet beneath that rhythm lay exhaustion. Entire communities were worn down by poverty, drugs, and the quiet understanding that official systems had failed them. In that vacuum, street economics became its own reality, complete with rules, hierarchies, and consequences. Rich Porter understood those rules early. He didn't romanticize the streets, but he respected their power. Where others chased fast money with little regard for tomorrow, he moved with patience. He observed. He listened. He learned. And in a world where impatience often led to early graves or prison cells, patience became his most dangerous weapon. People noticed how he dressed, not flashy in a careless way, but polished, intentional. Designer labels worn with ease, not arrogance. Cars that reflected success without screaming for attention. He carried himself like someone who believed he belonged anywhere he stood. For young men watching from the sidelines, this composure was mesmerizing. It suggested control. Stability. A sense that chaos could be mastered if one was smart enough. But admiration always comes with a shadow. As Rich Porter's reputation grew, so did curiosity. How did he do it? How did he move so freely when others were constantly looking over their shoulders? Why did law enforcement seem always one step behind him? Questions layered upon questions, and in Harlem, unanswered questions rarely stayed quiet for long. Yet even as whispers followed him, Rich Porter remained grounded in something deeper than image. Those who truly knew him spoke of discipline. Of rules that were not to be broken. Of an insistence on structure in a world that lacked it. He believed that disorder was the enemy, not just to business, but to survival itself. This belief shaped everything, from who he worked with to how he handled conflict. Violence, when it came, was not chaos but consequence. Night after night, Harlem watched him move through the neighborhood, a familiar figure in an unfamiliar role. He wasn't elected. He wasn't crowned. But power rarely asks for permission. It settles where it finds strength, intelligence, and opportunity aligned. By the late 1980s, Rich Porter had become something close to royalty in the eyes of the streets. A prince, perhaps, young, influential, and seemingly untouchable. Still, beneath every legend lies a fragile truth. Power creates distance. Success isolates. The higher one climbs, the fewer people stand beside them at the top. And in the quiet hours, when the city slowed and reflection became unavoidable, even someone like Rich Porter could not escape the weight of that reality. Trust became selective. Friendship became conditional. Every smile carried the possibility of motive. What made his story so compelling was not just the wealth or the control, it was the contrast. A man who valued order in an environment defined by disorder. A leader who avoided attention yet commanded it effortlessly. A figure who represented both the dream and the danger of the streets in equal measure. Harlem saw in him what it wanted to see, proof that the system could be beaten, even if only temporarily. But history has a way of revealing the cost of such dreams. The same streets that lift someone up are often the ones that pull them back down. Loyalty, once unquestioned, becomes fragile under pressure. Success invites scrutiny, envy, and temptation. And time, relentless and impartial, moves everyone toward a reckoning. As 1987 unfolded, the city did not yet know how close it was to losing one of its most enigmatic figures. The nights continued. The whispers persisted. Rich Porter's empire stood firm, appearing stable, controlled, and insulated from collapse. To the outside world, he seemed invincible. To Harlem, he was proof that greatness could rise from concrete. Yet somewhere beneath the calm surface, forces were already shifting. Decisions made in silence. Doubts unspoken. Ambitions misaligned. The kind of changes that do not announce themselves until it is far too late. And when they finally do, they leave behind questions that echo for decades. This is where the story truly begins, not with gunfire or betrayal, but with stillness. With a city breathing in the dark. With a young man at the height of his power, unaware that history had already begun turning its pages. Harlem slept, but fate did not. Long before Rich Porter became a name spoken in hushed tones on Harlem street corners, he was simply a boy growing up in a neighborhood that demanded awareness far earlier than childhood should allow. Harlem in the 1970s was alive with sound and struggle, a place where resilience was learned by watching and survival was a daily lesson. Apartment buildings stood close together, their hallways echoing with footsteps, arguments, laughter, and the quiet fatigue of families doing their best with what little they had. It was here, within these tight spaces and crowded streets, that Rich Porter's sense of ambition first took shape. His family, like many others in Harlem, lived modestly. There was no illusion of comfort or guaranteed opportunity. Money was something that had to be stretched, protected, and often sacrificed. Adults spoke carefully about bills, about rent, about work that never seemed to pay enough. Children learned quickly that nothing came easily. From an early age, Rich observed these realities not with bitterness, but with curiosity. He watched how adults navigated hardship, how respect was earned, and how dignity could still exist even when resources were scarce. Harlem was a teacher, and its lessons were rarely gentle. On one block, music spilled from open windows, creating moments of warmth and joy. On the next, broken glass and boarded-up storefronts told a different story. Young Rich learned to read these contrasts instinctively. He understood which corners were safe, which were not, and which people carried influence beyond what their appearance suggested. These observations would later become part of his greatest strength, the ability to see patterns where others saw only noise. School offered structure, but it also revealed limitations. Teachers worked hard, but classrooms were overcrowded, and expectations often felt lower than they should have been. The message, whether intentional or not, was subtle yet persistent: do not expect too much. Rich felt this tension early. He was intelligent, quick to understand concepts, but restless within systems that seemed designed to prepare him for struggle rather than success. He didn't rebel loudly. Instead, he internalized the disconnect and began searching for alternatives. Outside, the streets offered a different kind of education. Older teenagers and young men moved with confidence, carrying themselves as if they answered to no one. They had money when others did not. They dressed well, spoke boldly, and commanded attention simply by existing. To a young boy watching from the sidelines, the contrast was impossible to ignore. These were not men with college degrees or office jobs. They were products of the same environment, yet they had found a way to rise above its constraints. Rich didn't idolize recklessness, but he did admire control. He noticed who survived year after year and who disappeared suddenly, either locked away or lost to the streets. Survival, he realized, wasn't about speed or bravado. It was about awareness, discipline, and knowing when to act and when to wait. Even as a teenager, he showed a quiet maturity, listening more than he spoke, observing more than he participated. At home, responsibility came early. Like many children in Harlem, Rich understood the importance of contributing, whether emotionally or practically. Independence was encouraged out of necessity. This bred a strong sense of self-reliance. He learned not to wait for help that might never arrive. If something was needed, it had to be found or earned. This mindset would later define his approach to life and business. The economic reality of Harlem during these years left little room for innocence. The drug trade was becoming more visible, more normalized. Children saw transactions happen in plain sight. They heard the coded language, recognized the faces, and understood, even without explanation, that certain activities brought money and danger in equal measure. For Rich, this exposure did not immediately translate into action, but it planted an idea, that the underground economy followed rules just as structured as any legitimate one. What separated Rich Porter from many of his peers was not just ambition, but restraint. While others rushed toward quick money, he hesitated, studied, and calculated. He understood that the streets rewarded intelligence just as harshly as they punished mistakes. He was not driven by desperation alone, he was driven by vision. He wanted stability, not chaos. Control, not constant fear. As he grew older, the limitations of traditional paths became clearer. Jobs available to young men in Harlem offered little advancement and even less security. Watching adults work tirelessly without escaping financial strain left a lasting impression. Rich began to question the fairness of a system that demanded so much while offering so little in return. This wasn't resentment, it was realism. And realism pushed him toward alternatives that promised faster results. Harlem itself seemed to whisper possibilities. Every success story, however rare, spread quickly. Tales of men who had made money, built reputations, and commanded respect traveled block to block. Many of these stories ended poorly, but some endured long enough to inspire belief. Rich paid attention to which stories lasted and why. Longevity mattered more than flash. Survival mattered more than fame. By his late teens, Rich Porter had developed a clear understanding of his environment and his place within it. He knew the risks. He understood the consequences. Yet he also recognized the narrowness of his options. The streets were not a temptation, they were a reality woven into daily life. What mattered was how one navigated them. His early decisions were cautious. He aligned himself with people who shared his values, discipline, loyalty, discretion. He avoided unnecessary attention. He treated information as currency, understanding that knowing when to speak and when to remain silent could be the difference between success and disaster. These instincts, sharpened by years of observation, would later become essential. Looking back, it becomes clear that Rich Porter's rise did not begin with money or power. It began with awareness. With a young boy quietly absorbing the lessons of Harlem, its beauty, its brutality, its unspoken codes. He learned that ambition without discipline was dangerous, and discipline without ambition was limiting. To survive, one needed both. These formative years shaped not just his future, but his identity. They instilled in him a belief that control could be learned, that chaos could be managed, and that success, however fragile, was attainable. Harlem did not give Rich Porter his ambition, it refined it. And as the years passed, that ambition would soon find an outlet far larger than anyone could have imagined. By the time Rich Porter reached his late teens, Harlem no longer felt like a maze of unknowns. It felt familiar, almost predictable. The same faces moved through the same spaces each day, following routines shaped by survival rather than choice. For Rich, this familiarity did not breed comfort, it sharpened his awareness. He had spent years watching how money flowed, how respect was earned, and how mistakes were punished. When he finally stepped into his first hustles, it was not with excitement, but with caution. His earliest ventures were small, almost invisible by design. He understood that attention was a liability, especially for someone still learning the rules. While others chased fast money, Rich focused on consistency. He learned how to read people quickly, who was reliable, who talked too much, who acted out of fear rather than logic. These instincts were not taught, they were developed through observation and restraint. He treated the streets like a classroom, absorbing lessons quietly. The language of the streets was subtle. It wasn't just about words, but tone, timing, and silence. Rich learned when a pause meant hesitation and when it meant calculation. He learned that agreements were often unspoken, sealed not with handshakes but with mutual understanding. In this world, reputation traveled faster than truth, and a single misstep could follow someone for years. Rich guarded his carefully. Money came slowly at first. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden windfalls. Instead, there was a steady accumulation, enough to suggest potential without attracting envy. This patience set him apart. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was building something, even if he could not yet fully define what that something was. As he navigated these early hustles, Rich became increasingly aware of the thin line between opportunity and danger. He saw peers make reckless choices, expanding too quickly, trusting the wrong people, drawing unnecessary attention. Some disappeared quietly. Others became cautionary tales whispered about late at night. Each loss reinforced his belief that survival required discipline above all else. Mentorship in Harlem rarely came in formal terms. There were no sit-down lessons or clear guidance. Instead, knowledge was passed through example. Rich observed older hustlers who had managed to stay active for years without drawing heat. He studied their routines, their boundaries, their restraint. He noticed how they avoided excess, how they blended into the neighborhood rather than standing apart from it. From them, he learned that longevity was the true measure of success. Trust remained a rare commodity. Rich kept his circle small, preferring quality over quantity. He understood that loyalty could not be demanded, it had to be earned through consistency and fairness. Even in these early stages, he treated people with respect, paying on time, keeping his word, and avoiding unnecessary conflict. These choices, though subtle, began to shape his reputation. Harlem's economy at the time was evolving. The underground market was becoming more organized, more competitive. Information mattered as much as product. Rich paid attention to shifts in demand, to changes in police activity, to the unspoken signals that indicated when a block was heating up or cooling down. This situational awareness allowed him to move carefully, avoiding the kind of attention that ended careers before they truly began. What distinguished Rich Porter during this phase was his mindset. He did not see hustling as chaos, he saw it as a system. Every action had a reaction. Every decision carried weight. He believed that if the system could be understood, it could be navigated successfully. This belief gave him confidence, but not arrogance. There were moments of doubt. Nights when the risks felt heavier than the rewards. Times when he questioned whether the path he was on would lead anywhere lasting. But each time, the alternative paths available to him felt narrower, less promising. The streets, for all their danger, offered something rare, a sense of agency. The ability to shape one's own outcome, even if the odds were unforgiving. As his confidence grew, so did his ambition. Slowly, carefully, Rich expanded his activities. He sought better connections, more reliable partners, opportunities that promised growth without sacrificing control. He avoided unnecessary displays of wealth, understanding that success advertised too loudly invited problems. His focus remained inward, on structure and sustainability. These early hustles were not glamorous. They were quiet, methodical, often stressful. But they laid the foundation for everything that followed. Rich was learning how to manage pressure, how to balance risk and reward, how to maintain composure when situations became unpredictable. Each challenge strengthened his resolve and sharpened his instincts. By the time others began to notice his presence, Rich Porter was already steps ahead. He had built a reputation not for violence or flash, but for reliability. In a world defined by uncertainty, this made him valuable. People knew that dealing with him meant clarity, not chaos. That trust, once established, became a powerful asset. Looking back, it becomes clear that this period was less about money and more about identity. Rich was defining who he would be in the streets. Not a reckless player chasing headlines, but a strategist focused on longevity. These choices, made quietly and without applause, positioned him for the opportunities that were soon to come. The streets of Harlem were changing, and Rich could feel it. New substances, new players, new levels of money were on the horizon. The game was about to evolve, and those who failed to adapt would be left behind. Rich Porter, having mastered the fundamentals, was ready for the next phase, even if he could not yet see how high the stakes would rise. By the mid-1980s, a quiet shift began to move through New York City, one that would alter the rhythm of neighborhoods like Harlem in ways few could have predicted. It didn't arrive with a single announcement or dramatic moment. Instead, it crept in gradually, spreading from block to block, apartment to apartment, leaving visible changes in its wake. Crack cocaine had entered the streets, and with it came a new kind of economy, faster, harsher, and far more destructive than anything that had come before. For Harlem, already burdened by decades of disinvestment and limited opportunity, this shift felt both sudden and inevitable. The demand was overwhelming. Money moved at a speed the neighborhood had never seen. Where earlier hustles required patience and restraint, this new market rewarded volume and reach. Entire blocks transformed almost overnight. Corners that once held small groups of men now buzzed constantly, day and night, with activity. The streets no longer slept. Rich Porter watched these changes carefully. He did not rush in blindly, despite the obvious temptation. The crack era was different. It wasn't just about selling a product, it was about managing chaos. The profits were enormous, but so were the risks. Violence increased. Law enforcement attention intensified. Communities began to fracture under the weight of addiction and desperation. Rich understood that stepping into this new world without preparation would be dangerous. What separated him from many others was his ability to see beyond the immediate reward. He recognized that crack was not simply a drug, it was a force that would reshape everything around it. It accelerated time. Decisions that once unfolded over months now played out in days or even hours. Mistakes were punished quickly, often fatally. Rich approached this reality with caution, observing how others adapted and, in many cases, failed. As crack spread, so did competition. New faces appeared, drawn by the promise of fast money. Many lacked experience, discipline, or foresight. They moved loudly, recklessly, driven by urgency rather than strategy. Rich noted how quickly these individuals burned out, attracting police attention or provoking violent confrontations. Each collapse reinforced his belief that structure was essential. When Rich finally chose to involve himself more deeply, it was with intention. He focused on organization rather than volume. He sought reliable supply, dependable distribution, and clear lines of responsibility. Where others relied on intimidation, he emphasized efficiency. This approach allowed him to operate with less noise, even as the environment around him grew increasingly chaotic. The crack era also changed relationships within the community. Trust eroded as addiction took hold. People became unpredictable, driven by need rather than logic. Rich adapted by limiting exposure, keeping his circle tight, and avoiding emotional entanglements. He understood that empathy, while human, could be exploited in this environment. Boundaries became a form of protection. Historically, the crack epidemic did not arise in a vacuum. It was the result of broader social and political failures, economic inequality, aggressive drug policies, and the absence of meaningful support systems. For those living in Harlem, these forces felt distant and abstract, yet their consequences were immediate and personal. Families were torn apart. Streets became battlegrounds. Hope, already fragile, grew thinner. Rich Porter navigated this landscape with a steady hand. He did not celebrate the destruction around him, but he did not deny its reality either. To him, survival meant adaptation. He believed that refusing to acknowledge the new order would only leave one vulnerable. His focus remained on control, over his operation, his emotions, and his exposure. Money flowed in unprecedented amounts. With it came new temptations, luxury, excess, and the illusion of invincibility. Rich resisted the urge to indulge recklessly. He understood that wealth could be both shield and spotlight. Instead of drawing attention, he invested in stability. He reinforced loyalty through fairness rather than fear. These choices allowed his influence to grow quietly, even as others burned brightly and briefly. The streets, however, were unforgiving. Even the most careful players could not escape the broader consequences of the crack era. Violence became more common, often unpredictable. Innocent people were caught in the crossfire. The sense of community that once defined Harlem began to erode. Rich felt this loss acutely, even as he benefited from the new economy. It was a contradiction he carried silently. As his operation expanded, so did the pressure. Law enforcement adapted, increasing surveillance and raids. Informants became more common. The environment demanded constant vigilance. Rich responded by refining his systems, limiting communication, and staying several steps removed from daily activity. He understood that distance could provide protection, but it also created isolation. The crack era transformed Rich Porter from a cautious hustler into a strategic operator. It forced him to confront the realities of power and responsibility in a way few experiences could. Every decision carried weight, not just for himself, but for those connected to him. Mistakes could ripple outward, affecting families, neighborhoods, and lives. By the late 1980s, Harlem was no longer the same place it had been just a few years earlier. The pace was faster. The stakes were higher. Rich Porter stood near the center of this transformation, not as a symbol of chaos, but as someone who believed order could still exist within it. His ability to adapt without losing control set him apart. Yet beneath this outward stability, the crack era planted seeds of instability that no amount of discipline could fully contain. The rapid influx of money attracted attention, envy, and ambition. The system Rich had built, though strong, existed within a larger storm. And storms, no matter how well anticipated, always carry the potential for destruction. As the decade moved forward, it became clear that the crack era was not a temporary phase, but a defining chapter in Harlem's history. For Rich Porter, it marked the transition from cautious participant to powerful figure. The opportunity had been seized, but the cost, still unfolding, had yet to fully reveal itself. As the crack era tightened its grip on Harlem, Rich Porter began to move with a new level of precision. This was no longer a matter of small hustles or cautious experimentation. The scale had changed, and with it, the demands of leadership. Where chaos ruled the streets, Rich sought structure. He understood that without discipline, even the most profitable operation would collapse under its own weight. Order, he believed, was the difference between temporary success and lasting power. He approached the business the way others might approach a company. Every role mattered. Every movement had purpose. Instead of relying on intimidation alone, he built systems, clear chains of responsibility, controlled distribution points, and strict expectations. People knew what was required of them, and more importantly, they knew the consequences of failure. This clarity reduced confusion and limited unnecessary risk. In an environment fueled by impulse, predictability became a rare and valuable asset. Rich's vision extended beyond daily profit. He focused on sustainability. He paid attention to supply lines, ensuring reliability without overexposure. He understood that shortages created panic and panic led to mistakes. By maintaining consistency, he stabilized both income and behavior within his circle. This stability, in turn, attracted others who sought refuge from the volatility dominating the streets. Money flowed steadily, and with it came influence. Rich Porter's name began to circulate not just as a successful hustler, but as a leader who knew how to manage people. Respect grew not from fear alone, but from fairness. He paid on time. He resolved disputes efficiently. He discouraged unnecessary violence, understanding that every incident increased scrutiny. These principles set him apart in a landscape where recklessness was often mistaken for strength. Despite his growing power, Rich remained cautious. He avoided placing himself at the center of daily operations. Distance, he knew, was a form of protection. By limiting direct involvement, he reduced his visibility and insulated himself from immediate threats. This approach required trust, and trust had to be carefully cultivated. He chose his inner circle deliberately, valuing loyalty and discretion above all else. The environment, however, did not allow for complacency. Rival crews watched closely, assessing strengths and weaknesses. Law enforcement adjusted tactics, responding to the explosion of drug activity with increased surveillance and enforcement. Rich responded by tightening his organization further. Communication became more controlled. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. The fewer people who knew the full picture, the safer the operation remained. Harlem itself felt the impact of his rise. Money circulated through the neighborhood, supporting families and small businesses in indirect ways. At the same time, the cost of addiction grew more visible. Rich was aware of this contradiction. He lived within it, benefiting from a system that caused undeniable harm. Yet he justified his role through pragmatism. The system existed with or without him. His goal, as he saw it, was to navigate it as responsibly as possible. As his empire expanded, Rich Porter became increasingly aware of the psychological toll of leadership. Decisions were no longer about personal risk alone. They affected dozens, sometimes hundreds, of lives. A miscalculation could lead to arrests, injuries, or worse. This responsibility weighed on him, even if he rarely showed it. He learned to compartmentalize, separating emotion from decision-making. His lifestyle reflected this mindset. While he enjoyed the comforts that money provided, he avoided excess that would draw attention. Luxury was present, but controlled. Appearances mattered, but not at the expense of safety. He understood that visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny often led to downfall. This restraint reinforced his image as someone who played the long game. People around him noticed the difference. In a time when many leaders burned out quickly, Rich Porter remained steady. His operation weathered disruptions that crippled others. This resilience further enhanced his reputation. Young men looked to him as an example, seeing in his success a blueprint for survival. This admiration, however, carried its own risks. Influence attracted ambition, and ambition often bred jealousy. The growth of Rich's empire also deepened his isolation. As his circle expanded, his trust narrowed. The higher he rose, the fewer people he felt truly understood him. Conversations became guarded. Relationships were filtered through layers of caution. This emotional distance was both protective and costly, creating a quiet loneliness that accompanied his success. Yet at this stage, the structure held. The systems worked. Money flowed. Threats were managed. Rich Porter stood at the peak of his influence, having transformed opportunity into power through discipline and vision. To the outside world, his empire appeared unshakable. But beneath the surface, pressure continued to build. Expansion brought complexity. Complexity increased the potential for error. Each additional layer added vulnerability. Rich understood this, even as he pushed forward. Growth was necessary to maintain dominance, but it also introduced new challenges that could not always be controlled. In this moment, Rich Porter embodied the paradox of power. He had achieved what many in Harlem only dreamed of: control, wealth, and respect. Yet these achievements demanded constant vigilance. There was no pause, no true rest. The empire required attention at all times, and the consequences of neglect were unforgiving. As the late 1980s progressed, it became clear that Rich's greatest test would not come from external rivals or law enforcement alone. The true challenge would emerge from within, through relationships strained by pressure, loyalty tested by temptation, and the human limits of control in a world defined by instability. For now, the empire stood strong. But history rarely allows such balance to last forever. By the time Rich Porter reached the height of his influence, Harlem had already given him a title, even if it was never spoken aloud in any official way. To many, he was the neighborhood's quiet royalty, a symbol of success born from the same streets that had broken so many others. His presence carried weight. When he entered a room, conversations shifted. Eyes followed him, not out of fear alone, but out of curiosity and admiration. He had become proof that power did not always need to announce itself. His lifestyle reflected this balance. Wealth surrounded him, but it was worn with intention rather than excess. Designer clothes fit him effortlessly, not as costumes, but as extensions of his confidence. Cars gleamed under streetlights, polished and powerful, yet never ostentatious enough to scream for attention. He understood that image was a language, and he spoke it fluently. Every detail sent a message of control, success, and composure. What truly elevated Rich Porter's status, however, was not material display, it was generosity. In Harlem, where need was constant, he became known as someone who gave back. Bills were paid quietly. Families received help without public recognition. People remembered these gestures long after the moment passed. To them, Rich was not just wealthy, he was present. This generosity strengthened his bond with the community and deepened the sense that he belonged, even as he rose above everyday struggles. Young men, in particular, watched him closely. In a neighborhood short on visible role models, Rich represented a different path, one shaped by intelligence and discipline rather than chaos. They studied how he moved, how he spoke, how he carried himself. To them, he wasn't just successful, he was aspirational. This admiration, though flattering, also created pressure. Being a symbol meant expectations followed wherever he went. Despite his public image, Rich Porter remained deeply private. He understood the dangers of being too accessible. His personal life was guarded, his emotions rarely visible. Trust was reserved for a select few. Even among friends, there was distance. This separation was not born of arrogance, but necessity. Power attracted attention, and attention often carried hidden motives. Harlem itself responded to his rise in complex ways. On one hand, his success injected money into the neighborhood, providing resources that formal systems had failed to deliver. On the other, it reinforced the harsh reality that legitimate avenues to success remained limited. Rich embodied both hope and contradiction. He was admired, but his path also highlighted systemic failure. Nightlife became a stage where his influence was most visible. Lounges, clubs, and social gatherings shifted subtly when he arrived. People straightened up. Conversations grew more measured. He did not demand this respect, it followed him naturally. His calm demeanor, even in crowded spaces, suggested someone always aware of his surroundings, always calculating risk and reward. Yet beneath the polished exterior, Rich Porter felt the growing weight of expectation. Maintaining an image required constant effort. Every public appearance carried potential risk. A careless moment could be misinterpreted, exploited, or remembered. The line between admiration and envy was thin, and he walked it carefully. His generosity, while genuine, also carried unintended consequences. It created dependence in some and resentment in others. Not everyone benefited equally, and those left out noticed. In a community where resources were scarce, perceived favoritism could quickly turn admiration into suspicion. Rich navigated these dynamics with care, but no amount of awareness could eliminate them entirely. As his reputation spread beyond Harlem, so did the myths. Stories grew exaggerated. Some painted him as invincible, others as ruthless. The truth existed somewhere in between, but truth mattered less than perception. Rich understood that perception could shape reality. He allowed certain myths to persist, knowing they provided a layer of protection. Fear and respect often traveled together. Despite his elevated status, Rich never fully escaped the streets that raised him. He remained tied to Harlem emotionally, even as his influence expanded. The neighborhood struggles weighed on him. He saw addiction, violence, and loss daily. These realities contrasted sharply with his own success, creating a quiet tension he rarely acknowledged aloud. Power also reshaped his relationships. Friends from earlier years viewed him differently now. Some approached him with reverence, others with guarded distance. Conversations changed. Motives became harder to read. Rich learned to accept this shift, understanding that growth often came at the cost of simplicity. In private moments, away from the noise and attention, Rich Porter confronted the solitude of leadership. There were few people he could speak to honestly, fewer still who could understand the pressures he carried. Success had lifted him high, but it had also narrowed his world. This isolation, though rarely visible, influenced his decisions more than anyone realized. At this point in his story, Rich Porter stood as Harlem's fallen prince in waiting, though no one yet knew how fragile the crown truly was. He had achieved what many believed impossible. Wealth, respect, and influence rested firmly in his grasp. The streets admired him. The community depended on him. His name carried power. Yet history has a way of humbling even the most disciplined figures. The very qualities that elevated Rich Porter, trust, loyalty, generosity, would soon be tested. The admiration that surrounded him would attract forces beyond his control. And the image of stability he had carefully constructed would begin to crack under the weight of human ambition. For now, Harlem watched him move through the night, a calm figure amid chaos, believing that his reign would last. The streets had crowned him, and in doing so, they placed upon him a burden heavier than gold. Every empire, no matter how carefully built, rests on relationships. For Rich Porter, the most important of those relationships was forged not in boardrooms or back alleys, but in shared ambition and long nights of trust. This was where Alpo Martinez entered his story, not as a rival, not as a threat, but as a brother in spirit. Their bond would come to define both the height of Rich's power and the depth of his eventual tragedy. Alpo was different from Rich in many ways. Where Rich was measured and controlled, Alpo was impulsive, charismatic, and fearless to the point of recklessness. He carried himself with intensity, always moving, always thinking, always hungry for more. Yet this contrast is precisely what drew the two together. In Alpo, Rich saw energy and boldness. In Rich, Alpo saw vision and stability. Together, they felt unstoppable. Their friendship developed organically, shaped by mutual respect rather than formal agreement. They came from the same streets, understood the same codes, and shared a desire to rise above the limitations imposed on them since childhood. Conversations between them stretched long into the night, filled with plans, ideas, and unspoken promises. They didn't just talk about money, they talked about control, influence, and legacy. Trust between them grew quickly. Rich saw in Alpo someone willing to go where others hesitated, someone unafraid to take risks when necessary. Alpo, in turn, admired Rich's discipline and foresight. He trusted Rich's judgment, believing that following his lead would ensure survival and success. This mutual reliance created a powerful alliance, one that would soon reshape the streets of Harlem. As their partnership deepened, responsibilities became more defined. Rich remained the strategist, the organizer, the one who saw the entire board. Alpo became the executor, the man who could move swiftly, enforce decisions, and command respect on the ground. This division of roles worked, at least for a time. It allowed their operation to expand while maintaining internal balance. Their bond extended beyond business. There was genuine affection, moments of laughter, shared victories, and the unspoken comfort of knowing someone else understood the weight of their choices. In a world where trust was scarce, this connection felt rare and valuable. Rich believed that loyalty, once earned, could withstand pressure. Alpo believed the same. Harlem noticed their partnership. Together, they projected strength and unity. Rivals thought twice before challenging them. Associates felt protected by their combined influence. The streets whispered their names together, linking them as inseparable forces. To many, they represented the future of Harlem's underground, young, intelligent, and formidable. Yet even in the strongest bonds, tension can take root quietly. As success grew, so did expectations. Money multiplied, and with it came temptation. Alpo's appetite for expansion intensified. He thrived on action, on movement, on the thrill of growth. Rich, meanwhile, remained cautious, focused on stability and control. These differences, once complementary, began to create subtle friction. Alpo sometimes pushed for faster expansion, broader reach, riskier moves. Rich often slowed things down, emphasizing caution. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but the imbalance between them began to widen. Conversations that once flowed easily now carried undercurrents of disagreement. Trust remained, but it was no longer effortless. The streets amplified these tensions. Others noticed Alpo's growing boldness and whispered encouragement. Power has a way of attracting voices that validate ambition while downplaying consequence. Alpo listened. Rich sensed this shift, though he rarely confronted it directly. He believed in managing differences quietly, preserving harmony rather than provoking conflict. At the same time, Rich's increasing distance from daily operations created space for misalignment. While this distance protected him, it also limited his visibility into Alpo's evolving mindset. He trusted that their shared history and mutual respect would guide decisions. This trust, deeply rooted and rarely questioned, became both his strength and his vulnerability. Despite these emerging cracks, moments of unity still defined their relationship. When challenges arose, external threats, rival crews, law enforcement pressure, they stood together. In those moments, the bond felt unbreakable. Each crisis overcome reinforced the belief that whatever differences existed could be managed. Emotionally, Rich viewed Alpo as family. In an environment where biological family often carried its own struggles, chosen bonds held immense value. Betrayal from outsiders was expected. Betrayal from within felt unimaginable. Rich did not consider it a possibility worth entertaining. Alpo, for his part, grappled with conflicting emotions. Loyalty to Rich remained, but ambition pulled at him relentlessly. The pressure to prove himself, to claim recognition equal to Rich's stature, grew heavier. In the shadows of success, insecurity can fester. Alpo began to feel the weight of comparison, even as he benefited from the partnership. These internal struggles were invisible to most. On the surface, the alliance appeared strong. Harlem continued to see them as brothers, united and powerful. Few recognized the subtle shifts occurring beneath that image, the unspoken frustrations, the diverging priorities, the quiet recalibration of trust. Rich Porter, grounded in discipline and belief, continued forward with confidence. He believed that loyalty, once established, endured. He believed that structure could contain ambition. He believed that brotherhood was stronger than temptation. These beliefs had guided him successfully thus far, reinforcing his sense of control. But human nature is rarely so predictable. Ambition does not always respect boundaries. Pressure does not always reveal itself early. And trust, once assumed, can mask danger until it is too late. As their story moved forward, the bond between Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez stood at a crossroads. What had begun as a powerful alliance was now being tested by the very success it created. The streets remained unaware, watching only the surface, two men rising together, seemingly inseparable. Yet history often turns not on loud confrontations, but on quiet shifts in loyalty. And somewhere within this brotherhood, unseen forces were already at work, reshaping the future in ways neither man fully understood. As Rich Porter's influence spread beyond the familiar blocks of Harlem, the atmosphere around him began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. Expansion brought opportunity, but it also brought exposure. The streets that once felt predictable now carried new variables, new faces, unfamiliar dynamics, and a growing sense that the quiet balance he had worked so hard to maintain was becoming harder to control. With growth came visibility. People outside Harlem started paying attention, drawn by the scale and efficiency of what Rich had built. This attention was not always welcome. Rival crews watched closely, measuring his reach and calculating whether to challenge it. Some saw collaboration as safer than conflict, while others viewed his success as an obstacle to their own ambitions. Every expansion created new edges where friction could form. Law enforcement attention increased as well. The crack era had forced authorities to adapt, and operations of Rich's size no longer went unnoticed. Surveillance became more sophisticated. Informants surfaced where none had existed before. The streets felt different, tenser, quieter in some places, more volatile in others. Rich sensed this shift instinctively. He responded not with panic, but with refinement. He tightened communication channels, limiting who knew what and when. Information was compartmentalized. Trust, already scarce, became even more selective. This approach reduced risk, but it also created distance. Associates who once felt close now operated at arm's length. Efficiency improved, but warmth faded. Leadership required sacrifice, and Rich accepted this without complaint. Expansion also brought logistical challenges. Managing operations across multiple areas demanded coordination and discipline. Mistakes multiplied when systems grew too quickly. Rich focused on maintaining consistency, emphasizing training, accountability, and clear expectations. He believed that if each part functioned smoothly, the whole could withstand pressure. Yet no system is immune to human error. As operations expanded, the margin for mistakes narrowed. One careless action could ripple outward, attracting unwanted attention or provoking conflict. Rich spent more time anticipating problems than reacting to them. He learned to trust his instincts, even when they urged caution against tempting opportunities. The streets reflected this tension. Conversations grew guarded. People spoke in fragments, careful not to reveal too much. Nightlife still thrived, but beneath the music and laughter lay unease. Harlem had seen this pattern before, rapid growth followed by sudden collapse. Many wondered quietly how long Rich's empire could maintain its balance. Alpo Martinez, ever energetic and ambitious, thrived in this environment. He saw expansion as momentum, proof that they were winning. The risks energized him. Where Rich saw vulnerability, Alpo saw opportunity. This difference in perspective widened gradually, rarely erupting into open conflict but shaping decisions nonetheless. Rich tried to manage this divergence through dialogue and structure. He reminded Alpo of the importance of restraint, of the dangers that accompanied overreach. Alpo listened, but his appetite for action remained strong. Success had amplified his confidence, and confidence can sometimes blur caution. Meanwhile, the community felt the effects of expansion in complex ways. Money flowed more freely, but so did tension. Increased activity brought increased violence in surrounding areas. Innocent lives were affected. Rich was aware of these consequences, even if he rarely acknowledged them publicly. The weight of leadership grew heavier with each expansion. Sleep became harder to come by. The nights stretched long, filled with calculation and anticipation. Rich replayed scenarios in his mind, imagining outcomes and contingencies. This vigilance protected him, but it also drained him. The calm exterior he presented to the world masked an internal landscape shaped by constant alertness. Expansion also altered perceptions of Rich himself. To some, he was now seen less as a neighborhood figure and more as a regional power. This shift changed how people approached him. Respect mixed with fear. Familiarity gave way to formality. The human connections that once grounded him grew fewer. Despite these changes, Rich remained committed to his principles. He avoided unnecessary displays of dominance. He resisted pressure to escalate violence. He believed that control, not force, defined true power. This belief guided him, even as the environment tested it relentlessly. Law enforcement pressure intensified. Raids became more frequent. Arrests of peripheral players increased. Each incident served as a reminder that time was not on his side. Rich adjusted by creating layers of insulation between himself and daily operations. This protected him legally, but further deepened his isolation. The streets whispered more now. Rumors spread faster, often exaggerated or distorted. Some spoke of Rich as untouchable. Others speculated about internal tension, sensing shifts they could not fully explain. These whispers carried weight. Perception influenced reality, shaping how rivals and associates behaved. Through it all, Rich Porter maintained composure. He moved deliberately, refusing to let urgency dictate decisions. He trusted the systems he had built and the people he had chosen. Yet beneath this confidence lay awareness. Expansion had brought him to a crossroads. Every empire reaches a point where growth begins to test its foundations. For Rich, that point had arrived quietly, without ceremony. The balance he had achieved was now fragile, sustained by discipline and trust alone. One misstep, internal or external, could tip it irrevocably. As the late 1980s progressed, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. Success had elevated Rich Porter beyond the confines of Harlem, but it had also placed him in a wider arena where stakes were higher and consequences more severe. The empire still stood, impressive and influential, but the calm that once surrounded it had thinned. Unseen by most, pressures converged. Ambition pulled in one direction, caution in another. Loyalty was tested by temptation. Control strained under complexity. The expansion that had fueled Rich's rise now demanded a reckoning. The streets continued to watch, waiting for signs of weakness or triumph. And Rich Porter, ever disciplined, moved forward into uncertainty, knowing that power, once exposed, rarely remains stable for long. As the pressures of expansion settled into daily life, something more subtle began to change around Rich Porter. It was not a single event or obvious mistake, but a gradual shift in atmosphere, a quiet tightening that made even familiar spaces feel uneasy. Success had brought power, but it had also invited scrutiny from every direction. The balance he once maintained with such care now required constant effort, and even then, it felt increasingly fragile. Paranoia did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through small moments. A delayed response. A conversation that felt rehearsed. A look held just a second too long. In a world where information was currency, these details mattered. Rich began to notice things he once would have dismissed. He replayed interactions in his mind, searching for hidden meaning. This vigilance, while protective, slowly eroded the calm that had defined his leadership. Trust, already scarce, became even more selective. Rich reduced the number of people he spoke to directly. Decisions were filtered through layers, distancing him from the daily rhythm of the streets. While this approach reduced risk, it also limited his visibility. The more insulated he became, the harder it was to sense subtle changes before they grew dangerous. Inside his circle, pressure mounted. Money flowed steadily, but expectations grew heavier. Associates felt the weight of scrutiny and the fear of making mistakes. This tension altered behavior. People became cautious, sometimes overly so. Others acted out, driven by anxiety or ambition. These shifts disrupted the harmony Rich had worked to create. The bond with Alpo Martinez also felt the strain. Differences that once felt manageable now carried emotional weight. Alpo's energy and hunger for expansion clashed with Rich's increasing caution. Conversations grew shorter, more guarded. Neither man fully articulated his concerns, choosing instead to assume the other understood. This silence created space for misinterpretation. The streets amplified every rumor. Whispers of internal conflict spread, often exaggerated but rarely baseless. This careful balance of ambition and restraint became the hallmark of his rise. His ability to maintain control was amplified by his understanding of human behavior. He recognized that loyalty, once earned, could be fragile, and that reputation mattered as much as currency. He cultivated trust deliberately, rewarding those who demonstrated reliability and removing or distancing those who could not be counted on. By doing so, he created a network that functioned with efficiency and mutual interest. This structure, built on both respect and fear, allowed him to operate effectively in a world that rewarded boldness but punished error harshly. Yet, even as his influence expanded, the very qualities that enabled his rise introduced vulnerabilities. Discipline and foresight could not prevent betrayal, nor could they shield him from the unpredictability of human ambition. His close partnership with Alpo Martinez, once a source of strength, ultimately became a conduit for his downfall. This illustrates a broader truth: even the most careful planning is subject to the variables of trust and human emotion. In environments where stakes are high, the most dangerous threats are often internal rather than external. Rich's story also highlights the psychological cost of power. Achieving and maintaining influence in Harlem demanded constant vigilance. Every decision, interaction, and transaction required careful calculation. Sleep, peace, and emotional ease were luxuries rarely afforded. Wealth provided comfort, but it could not protect against fear, isolation, or the knowledge that one's safety was contingent on both perception and control. The crown he wore, invisible yet heavy, brought authority but also unrelenting responsibility. The consequences of ambition are further complicated by the structural realities of Harlem during this period. Poverty, limited opportunity, and systemic neglect created an environment where traditional pathways to success were restricted. The streets offered an alternative, but it was fraught with risk. Rich Porter's life demonstrates how intelligence, strategy, and discipline could yield extraordinary achievement, yet also how these successes exist within a framework of ongoing vulnerability. His story reflects the interplay between individual agency and structural constraint, showing that achievement is possible but always precarious. One of the most profound lessons from Rich's life is the fragility of trust. The betrayal that led to his death was not born of sudden malice, but of cumulative pressure, ambition, and fear. The same qualities that bind partnerships together, loyalty, shared history, mutual dependence, can also unravel under stress. Trust is rarely absolute, and in environments defined by high stakes, even close bonds are vulnerable. Understanding this dynamic is crucial to interpreting both Rich Porter's personal narrative and the broader mechanics of survival and influence in Harlem's street economy. Rich's legacy is also inseparable from the way culture remembers him. Through storytelling, music, and communal memory, his life has been mythologized. Rivals listened closely, searching for signs of weakness. Law enforcement pressure intensified, further tightening the environment. Rich felt as though he were navigating a narrowing corridor, where every step required precision. At night, the stillness offered little comfort. Sleep became restless, interrupted by thoughts of contingency and consequence. Rich found himself awake in the early hours, listening to the city breathe, replaying decisions and imagining outcomes. The calm he projected publicly contrasted sharply with his internal state. Leadership demanded composure, even when certainty faded. The crack era's volatility magnified these pressures. Violence in surrounding areas increased, often unpredictably. Innocent lives were affected, deepening the moral complexity of Rich's position. He carried this awareness quietly, rarely allowing it to influence outward decisions. Emotion, he believed, could cloud judgment. Yet emotion found its way in regardless. Fear, once a distant concept, became familiar, not fear of rivals or law enforcement, but fear of betrayal. Rich understood that most empires did not fall from external attack alone. They collapsed from within, undone by broken trust and misaligned ambition. This understanding weighed heavily on him. Communication within his organization became increasingly formal. Warmth faded, replaced by efficiency. While this protected operations, it also alienated people who once felt personally connected to Rich. Some interpreted this distance as distrust. Others saw it as weakness. Perception shifted, and perception mattered. Alpo, sensing the change, reacted differently. Where Rich withdrew, Alpo pushed forward. He sought validation in action, proving his value through bold moves. This divergence widened the emotional gap between them. Rich noticed, but hesitated to intervene forcefully. Confrontation risked fracture, and fracture felt dangerous. The irony was clear, the very discipline that had built Rich's empire now contributed to its tension. Control required boundaries, but boundaries created distance. Distance bred misunderstanding. Rich navigated this paradox with increasing difficulty, aware that no choice was without consequence. Externally, his reputation remained strong. To the streets, Rich Porter still appeared composed, powerful, and in control. Few saw the internal recalibration underway. The mask of stability held, even as cracks formed beneath the surface. Moments of doubt surfaced more frequently. Rich questioned whether expansion had gone too far, whether consolidation might offer safety. Yet reversing course carried its own risks. Retreat could signal weakness. In the streets, perception often dictated reality. Rich found himself trapped between caution and expectation. This period marked a turning point, not in action, but in atmosphere. The sense of inevitability grew stronger. The calm confidence that once guided Rich began to give way to vigilance. Every decision felt heavier, every silence louder. The empire still functioned. Money still flowed. Loyalty still existed. But something intangible had shifted. The foundation, once solid, now required constant reinforcement. Rich understood that pressure exposed character, and character determined outcomes. He wondered, quietly, how those around him would respond when tested. As the days passed, the tension settled deeper, becoming part of daily life. Rich Porter moved forward with discipline and resolve, but the ease that once defined his rise was gone. In its place stood awareness, sharp, unrelenting, and unforgiving. History often marks downfall with dramatic moments, but the true beginning usually lies in quieter shifts. For Rich Porter, this was that moment. Not a collapse, not yet, but the unmistakable feeling that the ground beneath him was no longer as stable as it once had been. The coldness did not arrive with violence or sudden betrayal. It settled slowly, like winter creeping through the city, changing the way people moved, spoke, and looked at one another. In Harlem, where warmth once lived in familiarity, the streets began to feel distant. Rich Porter sensed it first in small ways, in conversations that ended too quickly, in eyes that avoided his, in silences that lingered longer than they should have. Something fundamental was shifting, and it could not be ignored. Loyalty, once assumed, now required constant confirmation. People who had stood close grew cautious, careful with their words. It wasn't fear of Rich himself, but fear of the environment. Pressure from law enforcement, rivals, and internal expectations had created a climate where self-preservation overshadowed unity. Rich understood this intellectually, yet emotionally it felt like a quiet betrayal. Meetings became tense. Decisions were questioned indirectly, through hesitation rather than confrontation. Rich noticed how associates deferred responsibility, avoiding ownership of outcomes. This behavior, while understandable, disrupted the clarity he valued. Accountability blurred. The structure that once held everything together strained under the weight of uncertainty. The nights felt different. Streets that once hummed with predictable rhythm now carried an edge of unpredictability. The glow of streetlights revealed fewer familiar faces. People moved quickly, heads down, as if trying not to be seen. Harlem had entered a phase where survival instincts dominated every interaction. Rich adapted as best he could. He tightened control, reaffirmed expectations, and reminded his circle of the importance of unity. But words alone could not restore trust once it began to erode. Trust required shared confidence, and confidence was in short supply. Fear had become the unspoken constant. Alpo Martinez reacted to this environment in his own way. He moved more aggressively, pushing forward as if speed could outrun uncertainty. His actions, though effective in the short term, intensified tension. Rich watched carefully, concerned that boldness might attract the very attention they needed to avoid. Their differing responses highlighted a deeper divide in philosophy. Where Rich sought insulation, Alpo sought assertion. This divergence played out quietly, through decisions and timing rather than open conflict. Yet its impact was undeniable. Associates felt caught between two approaches, unsure which path to follow. Confusion grew, and with it, vulnerability. The streets whispered. Rumors of fractures within Rich's organization circulated, some exaggerated, others rooted in truth. Rivals listened closely, sensing opportunity. Law enforcement, too, seemed to tighten its focus. Every move felt watched. Every mistake felt magnified. In this environment, even small incidents carried heavy consequences. A miscommunication. A missed delivery. A careless remark. Each event chipped away at stability. Rich responded by increasing oversight, but oversight often felt like scrutiny. People interpreted caution as mistrust, further weakening bonds. Sleep became elusive. Rich found himself awake at night, replaying conversations and decisions. The silence amplified doubt. He questioned whether his leadership style, once a source of strength, had become a liability in this new climate. Adaptation was necessary, but adaptation carried risk. Emotionally, Rich felt isolated. The higher he had risen, the fewer people he could confide in. Conversations lacked honesty, filtered through layers of caution. This isolation deepened his sense that something was slipping beyond his control. Yet he maintained composure, understanding that visible uncertainty could accelerate collapse. The community, too, felt the chill. Addiction and violence continued to take their toll. The sense of collective resilience that once defined Harlem felt strained. Rich observed these changes with a mix of responsibility and helplessness. He could influence his operation, but he could not reverse the broader forces reshaping the neighborhood. Despite everything, moments of loyalty still appeared, quiet gestures, subtle acts of commitment. These moments reminded Rich why he had built his empire on principles rather than fear. Yet they were fewer now, overshadowed by anxiety and self-interest. Alpo's behavior grew increasingly unpredictable. His hunger for action seemed fueled by pressure, not confidence. Rich sensed a growing distance between them, though neither addressed it directly. Silence became their default, filled with unspoken questions and unresolved tension. The coldness of the streets mirrored the emotional distance within Rich's circle. Familiarity gave way to formality. Conversations were transactional. Trust became conditional. Rich recognized the signs, having seen similar patterns play out in other stories. He knew that when loyalty began to fracture, collapse was never far behind. Yet knowing did not equal control. Rich found himself reacting rather than leading, adjusting to circumstances rather than shaping them. This realization unsettled him. His strength had always been foresight. Now, foresight felt clouded by uncertainty. The winter of trust had arrived. Not announced, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The warmth that once bound his circle had faded, replaced by caution and fear. Rich Porter stood at the center of this shift, aware that the most dangerous threats no longer lay outside his circle. As days passed, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. The streets had turned cold, and with that cold came the realization that loyalty, once fractured, rarely returns whole. Rich continued forward, disciplined and composed, but the quiet certainty that had once guided him was gone. In the stillness of late-night Harlem, under flickering streetlights and distant sirens, Rich Porter faced a truth few leaders escape: power cannot protect against human fear. And fear, once unleashed, changes everything. Alpo Martinez did not change all at once. There was no single moment when Rich Porter could point and say this is when everything shifted. Instead, the change unfolded gradually, layered over time, shaped by pressure, ambition, and the weight of expectation. At first, it appeared subtle, an impatience in his voice, a restlessness that hadn't been there before. Alpo, once energized by partnership, now seemed driven by something deeper and more volatile. Success had amplified Alpo's strengths, but it had also magnified his insecurities. He had always been bold, always hungry, but now that hunger felt sharper, less satisfied by shared victories. The streets praised his fearlessness, his willingness to take risks others avoided. That praise mattered to him more than he admitted. In a world where reputation was everything, Alpo wanted his name to stand on its own, not just beside Rich Porter's. Rich noticed these shifts in the way Alpo moved. He was faster now, more aggressive, less patient. Decisions that once would have been discussed were now sometimes made unilaterally. Alpo began pushing boundaries, expanding reach without fully weighing the consequences. To him, caution felt like stagnation. Momentum, he believed, was survival. Their conversations changed in tone. Where there had once been easy dialogue, there was now tension beneath the surface. Rich spoke of restraint, of tightening operations, of weathering the storm. Alpo listened, but his eyes betrayed frustration. He felt constrained, limited by a structure that no longer matched his ambition. The discipline that Rich valued felt, to Alpo, like a ceiling pressing down. Yet despite these differences, the bond between them remained emotionally complex. Rich still saw Alpo as family, as someone who had stood beside him through growth and pressure. He trusted their history, believing it would anchor them through uncertainty. That trust made him hesitate when doubts surfaced. Questioning Alpo felt like questioning the foundation of everything they had built together. Alpo, meanwhile, struggled with internal conflict. Loyalty pulled him one way, ambition another. The pressure to perform, to prove himself indispensable, grew heavier each day. He felt watched, not just by rivals or law enforcement, but by those within their circle who measured his worth through results. Fear crept in, the fear of being overshadowed, of losing relevance in an empire he helped build. The streets fed this fear. Voices whispered encouragement, praising bold moves and dismissing caution as weakness. In that environment, restraint felt risky. Alpo began to equate control with limitation, and expansion with power. Each successful move reinforced this belief, pushing him further down a path Rich viewed with concern. Rich attempted to recalibrate quietly. He adjusted roles, tightened oversight, and limited exposure. These actions, intended to protect everyone involved, were interpreted differently by Alpo. What Rich saw as leadership, Alpo sometimes saw as mistrust. This misalignment deepened the emotional distance between them. At night, Alpo's restlessness grew. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by thoughts of opportunity and threat. He replayed conversations, weighing perceived slights and imagined intentions. In this state, small disagreements took on outsized meaning. Paranoia, once external, began to turn inward. Rich sensed the growing instability but struggled to address it directly. Confrontation risked fracture, and fracture felt dangerous. He hoped time and pressure would settle Alpo, that shared responsibility would realign their paths. This hope, grounded in loyalty, blinded him to how far Alpo had already drifted. The difference in their responses to pressure became increasingly visible. Rich withdrew, seeking control through distance and structure. Alpo pushed outward, seeking control through action and dominance. These opposing strategies pulled their operation in conflicting directions, creating stress points that others noticed. Associates felt the shift. Some gravitated toward Alpo's energy, drawn by his decisiveness and confidence. Others remained loyal to Rich's steady leadership. This subtle division introduced instability, even if no one spoke of it openly. Unity, once assumed, now required careful maintenance. Alpo's behavior grew riskier. He took chances that made Rich uneasy, moves that generated quick gains but increased exposure. Each success emboldened him, reinforcing the belief that caution was unnecessary. Rich, watching from a distance, felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. If Alpo fell, the consequences would ripple outward, affecting everyone. Emotionally, Rich grappled with a growing sense of loss. Not loss of power, but loss of connection. The brotherhood he had valued felt strained, altered by forces neither had anticipated. He questioned whether leadership required harder boundaries, whether trust needed re-evaluation. These questions haunted him, especially in moments of quiet. Alpo, for his part, began to feel cornered by circumstances of his own making. The more he pushed, the more pressure followed. Law enforcement attention increased. Rivals took note. The streets grew less forgiving. Yet retreat felt impossible. Admitting doubt or slowing down felt like weakness, and weakness, in his mind, invited destruction. The tragedy of this phase lay in its silence. There were no explosive arguments, no dramatic confrontations. Instead, there was distance. Unspoken resentment. Assumptions left unchallenged. Each man believed he understood the other, even as understanding slipped away. Rich continued to move with discipline, believing that structure could contain ambition. Alpo continued to chase momentum, believing that speed could outrun danger. Neither fully recognized how these opposing beliefs were setting the stage for irreversible consequences. This was the descent, not marked by violence, but by divergence. Two paths, once aligned, now slowly separating. The streets, indifferent and watchful, absorbed these shifts without comment. History, however, was already taking note. What made this period so dangerous was not the presence of enemies, but the erosion of certainty. Loyalty, once unquestioned, now existed alongside doubt. Trust, once implicit, required proof. And ambition, once shared, now pulled in conflicting directions. Rich Porter stood at the edge of realization, sensing that something essential was slipping beyond his control. Alpo Martinez moved forward driven by fear and desire, unaware of how far he had already gone. Between them lay a silence heavy with consequence, waiting for the moment it would finally break. By this stage of his rise, Rich Porter possessed nearly everything the streets could offer: money, influence, protection, and respect. Yet peace, the one thing he had hoped success might eventually bring, remained elusive. Wealth had solved certain problems, but it had created others far more complex. Each night, surrounded by comfort and security, Rich felt a growing awareness that power did not quiet the mind. If anything, it sharpened every worry. The pressure of leadership weighed heavily on him. Decisions were no longer abstract, they carried real consequences for dozens of people. A wrong call could mean prison for someone else, violence spilling into the streets, or attention from authorities that could not be undone. This responsibility followed him everywhere, settling into his thoughts even during moments meant for rest. Sleep came lightly, interrupted by calculations and contingencies. Rich began to notice how constant vigilance shaped his behavior. He scanned rooms instinctively, measured voices, and evaluated motives without conscious effort. Conversations felt layered, rarely straightforward. Even among those closest to him, there was always an undercurrent of caution. He learned to speak carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing unnecessary. This restraint protected him, but it also isolated him. Luxury surrounded him, yet it felt strangely hollow. Expensive clothes, cars, and spaces offered comfort but no refuge. They insulated him from the outside world while amplifying his sense of separation from it. He moved through these environments with composure, but internally, he felt detached, as though observing his own life from a distance. The nights were the hardest. When the city quieted, there were no distractions left to dull thought. Rich lay awake listening to distant sirens and muffled voices drifting through open windows. In those moments, questions surfaced, about loyalty, about direction, about whether the path he had chosen could ever lead to something lasting. He rarely allowed himself to dwell on these questions, but they returned persistently. The contradiction of his position became increasingly clear. He had achieved control in a world defined by chaos, yet that control required constant effort. There was no pause, no moment when he could truly relax. Success demanded maintenance. Power demanded vigilance. The idea that he might one day step away felt unrealistic, almost dangerous. Emotionally, Rich carried the burden quietly. He did not share doubts or fears openly. Leadership, he believed, required strength, and strength meant restraint. Expressing uncertainty could undermine confidence, both his own and others. So he absorbed it, letting the weight settle deeper with each passing day. The community's struggles remained visible around him. Addiction continued to claim lives. Violence flared unpredictably. Families suffered losses that could not be repaired. Rich saw these realities daily, and they complicated his sense of success. He benefited from a system that caused undeniable harm, a truth he acknowledged privately, if not publicly. Relationships continued to shift under the strain. Friends from earlier years felt more distant, unsure how to connect with the man Rich had become. New relationships formed cautiously, filtered through layers of trust and verification. Genuine connection felt increasingly rare. Isolation became a constant companion. The tension with Alpo Martinez weighed heavily on Rich's mind. He sensed the growing divide but struggled to bridge it. Loyalty and history bound them together, yet their visions no longer aligned. Rich feared that confronting this openly could fracture what remained of their bond. Silence, though uncomfortable, felt safer. As pressure mounted, Rich found himself questioning the sustainability of everything he had built. Could an empire like his exist without eventually collapsing under its own weight? The streets offered no examples of lasting stability. History was filled with rises and falls, with leaders who believed they had mastered the game only to be undone by forces they underestimated. Despite these doubts, Rich maintained discipline. He continued refining operations, reinforcing boundaries, and minimizing risk where possible. He believed that preparation could mitigate danger, even if it could not eliminate it entirely. This belief had guided him this far, and he held on to it tightly. Yet there was an emotional cost to this constant control. Joy became muted. Moments that should have felt rewarding passed quietly, overshadowed by anticipation of the next challenge. The satisfaction of success faded quickly, replaced by the anxiety of maintenance. Rich began to understand that wealth without peace was a fragile achievement. Time itself seemed to move differently. Days blurred together, defined by meetings, decisions, and vigilance. The future felt uncertain, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, persistent way. Rich wondered how long he could sustain this level of intensity before something gave way. The streets, indifferent and relentless, continued their rhythm. Life went on around him, unaware of his internal struggles. To the outside world, Rich Porter remained composed, powerful, and confident. Few could see the toll beneath the surface. This phase of his life was marked not by external threats, but by internal reckoning. The realization that success did not equal peace forced Rich to confront the limitations of his control. He had mastered systems and people, but he could not master uncertainty. In these quiet moments of reflection, Rich faced a truth rarely spoken aloud in the streets: power cannot protect against exhaustion of the spirit. The crown he wore, though invisible, was heavy. And as he carried it forward, the weight grew harder to ignore. The price of the crown was not measured in money or enemies, but in the gradual erosion of peace. Rich Porter stood at the height of his influence, yet felt further from rest than ever before. The empire remained intact, but the man at its center felt increasingly alone. December settled over Harlem with a heavy stillness, the kind that quieted even the most restless streets. Winter had a way of slowing everything down, muting the noise and softening the edges of the city. On the surface, life continued as it always had: cars rolled by, conversations drifted through the cold air, lights flickered in apartment windows, but beneath it all was a sense of tension that had been building for months, unseen yet deeply felt. That night did not announce itself as significant. There were no omens in the sky, no sudden disruptions to routine. For Rich Porter, it began like countless other evenings, shaped by habit and vigilance. He moved with the same composure he always had, guided by instinct and experience. To those who saw him, he appeared calm, in control, unaware that time was narrowing around him. Harlem after dark carried its own rhythm. The cold pushed people indoors, leaving the streets quieter than usual. Footsteps echoed more clearly. Voices carried farther. Every sound felt amplified against the silence. In this environment, even familiarity could feel uncertain. Rich was accustomed to navigating such spaces, yet something about the night felt different, though not different enough to demand alarm. The hours passed without incident. Conversations unfolded, plans were discussed, and decisions were made, all within the controlled framework Rich had built over years. Yet unseen forces were already in motion. Choices made elsewhere, driven by fear, ambition, and desperation, were converging toward an outcome no one present could yet comprehend. When violence finally came, it did not erupt in chaos. It arrived swiftly, decisively, and without warning. The stillness of the night shattered, replaced by shock and disbelief. In those brief moments, the weight of everything Rich had built, the relationships, the power, the careful control, collapsed into a single irreversible event. News traveled fast in Harlem, faster than official confirmation ever could. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into stunned silence. People struggled to reconcile the idea that Rich Porter, the man many believed untouchable, was gone. The streets absorbed the news with a mixture of grief and disbelief. For some, it felt unreal, as if the story must be wrong. By morning, the reality settled in. Harlem woke to a different world. The absence was palpable, felt in the quiet spaces Rich once occupied. Corners where his presence had commanded respect now stood empty. Conversations paused when his name was spoken, as if saying it aloud might somehow undo what had happened. The shock rippled outward, affecting everyone connected to him. Associates, friends, and community members struggled to process the loss. For many young men, Rich had represented stability in an unstable world. His death shattered that illusion, forcing a painful reckoning with the fragility of power. There was confusion in the immediate aftermath. Questions surfaced without answers. Who could have done this? How had it happened? Why now? Speculation filled the void left by uncertainty. In the absence of clarity, rumors flourished, some closer to truth than others. The emotional weight of the moment was heavy. Grief mixed with fear, anger, and disbelief. People who had relied on Rich, financially, emotionally, or symbolically, felt unmoored. The structure he had built did not vanish overnight, but without its center, it felt vulnerable, exposed. Law enforcement moved quickly, drawn by the magnitude of the event. Their presence intensified the atmosphere, bringing scrutiny and pressure to an already shaken community. For those involved in Rich's operation, the days following his death were filled with tension and uncertainty. Every move felt risky. Every decision carried heightened consequences. Harlem itself seemed to slow, as if absorbing the loss. The streets felt quieter, heavier. People spoke more softly. Laughter felt out of place. The night air carried a sense of mourning, even among those who had never known Rich personally. His story had become intertwined with the neighborhood's identity, and his absence left a void. For Rich Porter's family and those closest to him, the pain was deeply personal. The public image of power and success faded, replaced by the reality of loss. Behind every legend is a human being, and in that moment, Harlem was forced to confront that truth. The man behind the name was gone, leaving grief that could not be measured by reputation alone. As hours turned into days, the magnitude of what had occurred began to settle. Rich's death marked more than the end of a life, it marked the end of an era. The balance he had maintained, however fragile, was gone. The streets sensed it immediately. Power vacuums do not remain empty for long, and uncertainty breeds movement. Yet amid the fear and speculation, there was also reflection. People remembered moments of generosity, of fairness, of leadership. They spoke of his discipline, his composure, his ability to bring order to chaos. These memories softened the sharpness of the loss, even as they deepened the sadness. The night Rich Porter died became a dividing line in Harlem's history. Before it, there was the belief, however fragile, that control could be maintained, that discipline could shield against collapse. After it, that belief was shattered. The streets had once again proven their indifference to power and preparation. Silence followed the initial shock, a heavy pause as everyone waited to see what would come next. The future felt uncertain, shaped by forces now unleashed. For those who had depended on Rich's leadership, the question loomed large: what happens when the man holding everything together is suddenly gone? In the quiet aftermath, one truth became clear. Rich Porter's story was no longer just about rise and power. It had become a cautionary tale etched into the fabric of Harlem, a reminder that even the most careful paths can end abruptly. That December night, Harlem did not just lose a leader. It lost a sense of stability, a symbol of possibility, and a chapter of its own identity. The streets would move on, as they always did, but they would never forget the night they went silent. In the days following Rich Porter's death, Harlem existed in a state of suspended disbelief. The shock had not yet hardened into understanding, and grief mingled with confusion in every conversation. People searched for explanations that could make sense of the impossible. The streets had always been dangerous, but this felt different. This was not the fall of a reckless man or a careless mistake. This was the loss of someone who had built his power carefully, deliberately, and with discipline. The question echoed quietly everywhere: how could this have happened? At first, suspicion pointed outward. Rivals. Jealous competitors. Unfinished business from the past. These explanations felt familiar, almost comforting in their simplicity. The streets were accustomed to external threats. It was easier to believe that Rich Porter had fallen to enemies than to imagine something closer, something far more unsettling. But rumors have a way of shifting. As days passed, whispers began to circulate that did not fit the usual narrative. These whispers were hesitant at first, shared only in trusted circles, spoken softly as if the words themselves carried danger. They suggested that the truth lay not outside Rich's circle, but within it. The idea was unthinkable to many. Rich had built his empire on loyalty. He had chosen his inner circle carefully, valuing trust above all else. The notion that betrayal could come from someone so close felt like a violation of the very principles he stood for. Yet the whispers persisted, growing harder to ignore. When Alpo Martinez's name began to surface, the reaction was disbelief. To those who knew their history, the idea seemed impossible. Rich and Alpo were brothers in the eyes of the streets. They had risen together, shared victories, weathered pressure side by side. Their bond was part of Harlem's mythology. To imagine that bond shattered by betrayal felt like rewriting the story entirely. As the truth slowly emerged, it did so without spectacle. There were no dramatic confessions, no immediate clarity. Instead, details surfaced gradually, pieced together through investigation and quiet admissions. Each new piece of information deepened the sense of tragedy. The betrayal was not impulsive. It was calculated, shaped by fear and desperation. Understanding Alpo's role did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of pain, one rooted in the complexity of human motives. Alpo had not acted out of pure malice. He had acted out of fear for his own survival, driven by the pressure closing in around him. This did not excuse the betrayal, but it explained how it became possible. The realization forced Harlem to confront uncomfortable truths. Loyalty, even when deeply rooted, could fracture under enough strain. Brotherhood, no matter how genuine, was not immune to fear. The streets had always preached these lessons, but seeing them play out in such a devastating way made them impossible to ignore. For those closest to Rich, the revelation was crushing. The grief of loss deepened into something heavier, anger, confusion, and a sense of profound violation. Trust, once broken, left scars that could not be easily healed. People questioned their own judgments, wondering how they had missed the signs. Alpo's actions reshaped his image overnight. The man once admired for his boldness and loyalty became a symbol of betrayal. The streets turned cold toward his name. Conversations that once praised him now carried condemnation. Yet even in this shift, there was an undercurrent of sadness. His story, too, was now a tragedy. The betrayal altered the narrative of Rich Porter's life and death. His fall was no longer seen as the inevitable result of street life alone, but as the consequence of fractured trust. This reframing made his story more painful, but also more human. It underscored the fragile nature of power built on relationships. Law enforcement's role in uncovering the truth brought little comfort. Justice, when it came, felt distant and incomplete. No outcome could restore what had been lost. The damage extended beyond one life, rippling through families, friendships, and the broader community. Harlem absorbed the betrayal with a mix of resignation and reflection. The streets had always known betrayal, but this felt personal. Rich had been one of their own, someone who embodied discipline and respect. His death, at the hands of someone so close, became a warning etched deeply into collective memory. As the full picture emerged, the focus shifted from shock to understanding. People began to see the pressures that had pushed Alpo to such a decision, the fear of law enforcement, the paranoia, the narrowing options. None of this softened the betrayal, but it offered context. In the streets, context matters. Rich Porter's legacy took on new depth in light of the truth. His commitment to loyalty, once seen as a strength, now carried tragic irony. He had trusted deeply in a world that punished trust. Yet this did not diminish his character. If anything, it highlighted the values he refused to abandon, even at great cost. The betrayal left a lasting imprint on Harlem's psyche. It reinforced the lesson that power isolates, that trust must be guarded, and that fear can override even the strongest bonds. These lessons were not new, but they were renewed with painful clarity. In the quiet moments that followed, people spoke less of Alpo and more of Rich. They remembered his discipline, his generosity, his attempt to bring order to chaos. The betrayal did not define him. It defined the tragedy of his end. The unthinkable truth had been revealed, and with it came a somber understanding. Rich Porter's story was no longer just about rise and fall. It was about loyalty tested beyond its limits, about the human cost of fear, and about how even the strongest brotherhoods can fracture under pressure. Harlem moved forward, as it always did, carrying the weight of this lesson. The streets would continue to produce stories of ambition and loss, but this one would endure, whispered quietly as a reminder of how close trust and tragedy can truly be. After Rich Porter was gone, Harlem felt unbalanced, as if something essential had been removed from its center. The streets still looked the same on the surface, brick buildings, corner stores, familiar faces, but the rhythm had changed. The quiet order Rich had imposed, often without people realizing it, was suddenly absent. In its place came uncertainty, and uncertainty moved quickly through every layer of the neighborhood. An empire does not disappear overnight, but without its leader, it begins to unravel in subtle ways. Decisions once made with clarity now stalled. Instructions that once carried authority were questioned or ignored. People who had relied on Rich's judgment found themselves unsure of who to trust. The structure he had built remained, but its foundation had been shaken. In the days immediately following his death, fear dominated. Associates kept their distance, unsure who might be next. Conversations were brief and guarded. Everyone understood that power vacuums invite danger. Where leadership falters, ambition rushes in. Harlem had seen this cycle many times before, and it never ended gently. Rival crews watched closely. Some moved cautiously, waiting to see how things would unfold. Others saw opportunity and acted quickly, testing boundaries that had once been firmly enforced. Corners that had remained stable for years suddenly became contested. Tension simmered beneath everyday interactions, ready to surface at any sign of weakness. Within Rich's organization, confusion reigned. Loyalty, once anchored to his presence, felt untethered. Some remained committed to preserving what he had built, honoring his memory through restraint. Others, driven by fear or ambition, looked for ways to secure their own survival. Unity fractured quietly, not through open conflict, but through shifting priorities. The absence of Rich's calm leadership made itself known in unexpected ways. Disputes that he would have resolved swiftly now lingered. Small disagreements escalated. Without a central authority, enforcement became inconsistent. This inconsistency bred resentment, further weakening cohesion. Harlem's community felt the change as well. Rich had played an unspoken role in maintaining balance. His presence discouraged reckless violence. His generosity supported families quietly. With him gone, that stability faded. Addiction continued to take its toll, and violence crept into spaces that had once felt relatively safe. People spoke of Rich more often now, recalling his discipline and composure. Stories of his fairness circulated, sometimes idealized, sometimes painfully accurate. In remembering him, Harlem also confronted what it had lost. He had not been a savior, but he had been a stabilizing force in an unstable world. Law enforcement pressure intensified in the aftermath. Investigations expanded, arrests increased, and scrutiny deepened. The collapse of leadership made operations easier to penetrate. Without Rich's insulation and foresight, vulnerabilities surfaced quickly. Those involved felt the walls closing in, compounding fear and desperation. Amid this chaos, the emotional impact lingered. This approach required trust, and trust had to be carefully cultivated. He chose his inner circle deliberately, valuing loyalty and discretion above all else. The environment, however, did not allow for complacency. Rival crews watched closely, assessing strengths and weaknesses. Law enforcement adjusted tactics, responding to the explosion of drug activity with increased surveillance and enforcement. Rich responded by tightening his organization further. Communication became more controlled. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. The fewer people who knew the full picture, the safer the operation remained. Harlem itself felt the impact of his rise. Money circulated through the neighborhood, supporting families and small businesses in indirect ways. At the same time, the cost of addiction grew more visible. Rich was aware of this contradiction. He lived within it, benefiting from a system that caused undeniable harm. Yet he justified his role through pragmatism. The system existed with or without him. His goal, as he saw it, was to navigate it as responsibly as possible. As his empire expanded, Rich Porter became increasingly aware of the psychological toll of leadership. Decisions were no longer about personal risk alone. They affected dozens, sometimes hundreds, of lives. A miscalculation could lead to arrests, injuries, or worse. This responsibility weighed on him, even if he rarely showed it. He learned to compartmentalize, separating emotion from decision-making. His lifestyle reflected this mindset. While he enjoyed the comforts that money provided, he avoided excess that would draw attention. Luxury was present, but controlled. Appearances mattered, but not at the expense of safety. He understood that visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny often led to downfall. This restraint reinforced his image as someone who played the long game. People around him noticed the difference. In a time when many leaders burned out quickly, Rich Porter remained steady. His operation weathered disruptions that crippled others. Grief was layered with anxiety. For some, Rich's death marked the end of a dream, the belief that discipline and intelligence could carve out lasting control in the streets. That belief now felt fragile, perhaps naive. Younger men who had once looked up to Rich struggled to reconcile his fate with their aspirations. His rise had inspired them. His fall forced them to question everything. Some hardened, embracing cynicism. Others withdrew, recognizing the cost of ambition too clearly. The streets, indifferent yet observant, absorbed these shifts. Power redistributed unevenly. New figures emerged, but none carried the same balance Rich had maintained. Violence became more unpredictable. The sense of order dissolved, replaced by volatility. In quiet moments, people reflected on how quickly everything had changed. One absence had altered an entire ecosystem. It was a reminder of how dependent systems can become on individuals, even in environments that claim to reject authority. As weeks passed, the initial shock faded, replaced by a dull acceptance. Life continued, as it always does. But Harlem was not the same. Rich Porter's empire had not simply lost its king, it had lost its center of gravity. The streets moved on, but they carried his absence like a shadow. And in that shadow, the lesson lingered: power without continuity is fragile, and stability, once broken, is difficult to restore. After Rich Porter's death, Alpo Martinez found himself thrust into a world that had shifted beneath his feet. The streets that had once felt navigable under the guidance of his partner now seemed unpredictable, each corner hiding opportunity and danger in equal measure. The balance that had defined their partnership was gone, leaving Alpo to navigate alone, propelled by fear, ambition, and the relentless demands of survival. The loss of Rich did more than remove a collaborator, it removed the anchor that had kept him tethered to restraint and reason. Alpo's instincts, once tempered by partnership, now dominated his decisions. He moved faster, striking deals with urgency, asserting his presence where caution had previously reigned. The adrenaline of action became a constant, driving choices that prioritized immediate gain over long-term stability. The streets, which had once responded to the calculated discipline of Rich Porter, now reacted to the volatility and unpredictability that Alpo embodied. Allies and rivals alike noticed the shift, some with admiration, others with trepidation. Trust, always a fragile commodity, eroded further. Associates who had once relied on Rich's steady hand now faced Alpo's more impulsive style. Some adapted, seeing opportunity in his decisiveness. Others grew wary, uncertain if loyalty would protect them or if ambition would override principle. The operation's cohesion began to fray quietly, the cracks subtle at first, then widening with every rash decision. Alpo, caught between the desire to maintain power and the compulsion to act, often failed to see the impact his choices had on those around him. The psychological toll was relentless. Alpo oscillated between confidence and paranoia, always alert to threats both real and imagined. He became increasingly sensitive to perceived slights, interpreting hesitation or caution from his associates as challenges to his authority. Every encounter required assessment, every conversation weighed for hidden meaning. This constant vigilance, while protective in one sense, intensified the pressure, making every moment a potential trigger for rash action. Violence became an instrument both strategic and reactive. Alpo employed it to assert dominance, to enforce loyalty, and to silence perceived threats. Unlike Rich, who had preferred structure and negotiation, Alpo often allowed emotion to guide execution. Each act reinforced his reputation as unpredictable and dangerous, but it also increased the likelihood of miscalculations that could draw law enforcement attention or spark retaliation from rivals. Law enforcement, ever adaptive, began to close in. With Rich gone, the operational discipline that had shielded the enterprise weakened. Surveillance intensified, investigations expanded, and informants became more valuable to authorities. Every transaction, every movement, was potentially under scrutiny. Alpo responded with increased caution in some areas, yet simultaneously accelerated operations in others, creating an inherent tension between risk and reward. The street environment amplified these pressures. Rival crews tested boundaries, probing for weakness. Opportunists emerged, willing to exploit any gap in authority. Alpo's response to these challenges was often aggressive, intended to reassert dominance, but each act carried unintended consequences. Retaliation and suspicion spread quickly, destabilizing areas that had once been under careful control. Emotionally, Alpo struggled with isolation. The bond he had shared with Rich had been more than partnership, it had been a form of protection, a steadying influence that allowed him to balance ambition with restraint. Without that anchor, he felt exposed, compelled to act decisively in order to assert control. The loneliness of leadership, magnified by the high stakes of survival, weighed heavily, yet admitting vulnerability was impossible in a world where perception dictated reality. Financial pressure remained a constant undercurrent. Expansion, rapid transactions, and increased visibility required constant attention. Errors could lead to loss of revenue, legal consequences, or retaliation. Alpo's response was a mixture of precision and impulsivity, careful planning interspersed with high-risk actions designed to maintain momentum. This duality defined his operational style, creating both success and instability. The community around him felt the effects. Violence became more frequent, disputes more unpredictable. Families who had once looked to Rich for subtle stability now navigated uncertainty, wary of Alpo's more aggressive posture. The psychological landscape of Harlem shifted in response to his behavior. Where order once existed, there was now tension and unpredictability, and the subtle social contracts that had maintained relative calm began to fracture. Alpo's own reputation evolved in this period. Among associates, he was feared, respected, and admired in equal measure. His decisiveness commanded attention, but his unpredictability caused unease. The streets treated him with caution, recognizing both his capacity for violence and his strategic insight. This duality made him a figure simultaneously admired and mistrusted, a leader whose presence was both stabilizing and destabilizing. Internally, Alpo wrestled with moral ambiguity. Decisions made in survival mode often conflicted with earlier principles. Actions necessary for self-preservation sometimes clashed with long-standing codes of loyalty or fairness. Each compromise left a mark, shaping a persona increasingly defined by pragmatism and expedience rather than ideology. The cumulative effect of these pressures was a gradual unraveling. While Alpo maintained operational success, the personal cost was high. Trust eroded, alliances strained, and the psychological burden intensified. Each day demanded adaptation, calculation, and vigilance. Mistakes carried consequences, and the margin for error narrowed continuously. Ultimately, this period marked a profound transformation. Alpo Martinez evolved from a partner operating within a balanced system into a solitary figure navigating a high-stakes environment defined by unpredictability. His choices, driven by survival, ambition, and fear, reshaped both his identity and the landscape of Harlem. The streets, once stabilized by Rich Porter's measured control, now reflected Alpo's volatility, a city in motion, uncertain, and reactive. In these months, Alpo learned that survival demanded more than intelligence or strength. It required constant adaptation, decisiveness, and an acute awareness of both opportunity and threat. Every action reverberated beyond immediate consequence, influencing perception, loyalty, and danger. This relentless pressure defined his existence, reshaping him into a figure simultaneously powerful and imperiled, whose story would continue to unfold under the weight of both ambition and consequence. As Alpo Martinez continued to navigate the treacherous aftermath of Rich Porter's death, the walls of his world began to close in. Survival in Harlem had always demanded vigilance, but now the stakes were higher than ever. The network of alliances and partnerships that had once supported him was fracturing under the combined pressure of law enforcement, rival crews, and his own increasingly impulsive behavior. Every move he made carried amplified risk, and the margin for error had shrunk to nearly zero. The streets were unforgiving. Gossip traveled fast, rumors evolved into accusations, and perceived weaknesses were exploited without hesitation. Alpo's reputation as both bold and unpredictable made him a target. Rivals tested his authority, probing for gaps in control. Minor disputes could escalate quickly into confrontations, and every encounter carried the potential for lasting consequences. Survival required a constant balance between asserting dominance and avoiding overexposure, and Alpo increasingly struggled to maintain that balance. Law enforcement, meanwhile, had begun to close in more systematically. Unlike before, when the structure and discipline of Rich Porter's organization provided layers of insulation, Alpo now stood exposed. Surveillance intensified, investigations multiplied, and informants emerged from unexpected quarters. Each interaction in the streets, each transaction, became potentially traceable. The environment demanded that he adapt or face severe consequences, and Alpo responded with a combination of cunning and recklessness that brought him both success and peril. The pressure weighed heavily on his psychology. Paranoia became a constant companion, creeping into every decision. He scrutinized every conversation for hidden meaning, questioned loyalty at every level, and anticipated threats that might not exist. This hypervigilance was both protective and corrosive. It kept him alert to danger, yet it also amplified stress and clouded judgment. Emotional fatigue became inevitable, and sleep, once a brief respite, now offered little relief. Nights were spent replaying scenarios, imagining betrayals, and calculating the next move. Despite the growing tension, Alpo maintained an outward posture of control. He continued to assert authority, enforce discipline, and make bold decisions, projecting an image of dominance and unshakable confidence. Among associates and rivals alike, this projection reinforced his influence. People respected decisiveness, even when they feared the consequences of being on the wrong side. Yet this outward display masked the internal chaos and vulnerability that accompanied the pressure of constant survival. The duality of Alpo's existence became increasingly pronounced. On one hand, he was a figure of power, commanding attention and shaping the dynamics of Harlem streets. On the other hand, he was isolated, burdened by paranoia, distrust, and the relentless pressure to stay ahead of both law enforcement and those within his own circle. Every choice was fraught, every alliance tenuous. The psychological burden was immense, and mistakes carried irreversible consequences. As law enforcement pressure intensified, Alpo was forced to adapt strategically. Operations became more compartmentalized, communications were restricted to trusted individuals, and movements were calculated with greater precision. The informal systems that had worked in the past no longer sufficed. He needed structure, but the very structure that provided protection also restricted his freedom to act impulsively, the trait that had previously fueled his rise. The narrowing of options brought increasing desperation. Some associates, sensing the vulnerability, began to question loyalty or negotiate their own survival with authorities. Informants appeared in unexpected places, testing the boundaries of trust. Alpo responded with a mix of intimidation and enforcement, attempting to maintain control over both people and perception. Yet even this approach carried risk. heavy-handed actions could provoke retaliation or attract law enforcement attention. Every choice became a delicate calculus. Emotionally, the weight of inevitability grew heavier. Alpo had long lived by the code of the streets, where ambition and fear constantly intertwined. Now, the consequences of his previous decisions were converging, making it clear that his survival was not guaranteed. The combination of paranoia, isolation, and relentless pressure reshaped his behavior, pushing him toward increasingly high-risk decisions that could secure short-term gains but destabilize long-term prospects. The broader environment reflected these pressures. Harlem, once stabilized under Rich Porter's disciplined leadership, now moved unpredictably. Violence surged in areas previously under control, and disputes over territory or influence intensified. The vacuum left by Rich's absence had created both opportunity and danger, and Alpo's response was pivotal. He attempted to assert dominance while navigating a landscape that was simultaneously more volatile and more scrutinized. The margin for error was minimal, and any lapse could have catastrophic consequences. Eventually, the inevitability of legal consequence caught up. Alpo was confronted with the stark reality that survival in the streets alone was no longer sufficient. The pressures of law enforcement, coupled with internal instability, demanded a response that required a strategic recalibration. Cooperation with authorities became a tool for survival, a way to mitigate immediate danger while negotiating a more controlled path forward. This decision, like every other, was weighed against risk, loyalty, and self-preservation. The process of cooperating with law enforcement was complex. It required careful navigation to protect himself while providing information valuable enough to gain leverage. Each revelation had the potential to destabilize relationships, provoke retaliation, or create new vulnerabilities. Alpo's choices during this period reflected a nuanced understanding of both opportunity and threat. Survival demanded pragmatism, and pragmatism required compromise, sometimes with allies, sometimes with enemies, and sometimes with the law itself. Through this period, Alpo's behavior reflected the intersection of desperation and strategy. He maintained outward dominance while internally negotiating contingencies that could secure his safety. His reputation, both feared and respected, persisted, but the foundation upon which it had been built was shifting. Alliances were tested, trust became increasingly transactional, and the psychological toll intensified with each passing day. The end of the run marked a profound transformation. Alpo Martinez, once a partner in a disciplined, structured empire, had evolved into a figure navigating survival under unprecedented scrutiny and pressure. His choices, shaped by fear, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of control, reflected the delicate balance between influence and vulnerability. The streets, law enforcement, and internal pressures coalesced to force decisions that would define both his legacy and the trajectory of those around him. Ultimately, this period demonstrated a stark reality: survival in the streets of Harlem was not merely about strength or intelligence. It required adaptability, psychological resilience, and the willingness to make morally complex decisions. Alpo's journey during these months highlighted the fragility of power in the absence of stability, the costs of ambition, and the relentless pressure that accompanies the pursuit of control in an environment defined by uncertainty and danger. Even after the immediate violence and betrayals of the late 1980s faded into memory, Rich Porter's story did not disappear. Harlem remembered him, not only as a man who rose quickly through the streets, but as a symbol of possibility, discipline, and tragedy. Over time, his life began to exist on two levels simultaneously: the factual, grounded reality of his actions and influence, and the myth that grew around him, shaped by storytelling, music, and collective memory. Both layers reflected the complex ways in which communities process loss, ambition, and power. Hip-hop culture, which was emerging and solidifying during this period, played a significant role in immortalizing figures like Rich Porter. Artists drew inspiration from the streets, recounting tales of rise, betrayal, and survival. Porter's name appeared in lyrics not just as a warning, but as a representation of skill, intelligence, and audacity. In the songs, he became larger than life, a figure who navigated the underworld with a mix of cunning and composure, someone who commanded respect while eluding danger. The blending of fact and narrative in these cultural artifacts transformed him into a symbol that transcended the specifics of his life. At the same time, oral storytelling in Harlem kept his memory alive in a different way. Those who had known him personally recounted anecdotes emphasizing his discipline, his generosity, and his careful management of both business and relationships. Children and young adults listened to these stories, learning lessons about ambition, loyalty, and the cost of power. Rich Porter became both a cautionary tale and a model, proof that success was attainable, but that survival required constant vigilance and judgment. The mythologizing of his life was not limited to music or informal storytelling. As journalists, documentarians, and historians began to examine the crack era and its key figures, Rich's story emerged repeatedly as emblematic of broader trends. He was depicted as the disciplined hustler in an era defined by volatility, someone whose intelligence and foresight allowed him to rise where many others fell. These accounts emphasized contrasts, the careful strategy he employed against the chaotic backdrop of street life, the respect he earned despite widespread danger, and the tragedy of his premature death. In these retellings, the factual and symbolic dimensions of his life intertwined, creating a narrative that resonated far beyond the neighborhood he had once navigated daily. The duality of Rich Porter's legacy was striking. On one hand, he was a young man operating in an environment of extreme risk, making decisions that had tangible consequences for himself and those around him. On the other hand, he had become a legend, a figure whose life was interpreted as a story of ambition, intelligence, and inevitability. The tension between these layers reflects the human tendency to seek meaning in lives cut short, to transform complexity into narrative, and to preserve lessons through myth. Cultural memory also shaped how his story was perceived. In Harlem, discussions of Rich Porter often balanced admiration with reflection on the dangers of the lifestyle. Community members spoke about him with a combination of reverence and caution, emphasizing his intelligence and discipline while acknowledging the systemic factors, poverty, limited opportunity, the crack epidemic, that contextualized his choices. These conversations served both as tribute and as moral education, illustrating how individual decisions intersect with broader social realities. Over time, Rich Porter's story became a point of reference in broader dialogues about the era. Scholars and journalists used his life as a lens through which to understand the dynamics of Harlem during the crack epidemic, the pressures of ambition, the role of trust and betrayal, and the strategies employed by those seeking power in a dangerous environment. In these discussions, the myth surrounding him enhanced the lesson, making the narrative memorable and impactful for audiences who might never have walked the same streets. The layering of myth over fact did not diminish his accomplishments, rather, it highlighted the aspects of his character that were most instructive. Discipline, foresight, and composure became focal points in stories that otherwise could have been reduced to headlines about violence and crime. By emphasizing strategy over impulse, planning over recklessness, the narrative allowed listeners and readers to extract practical lessons about decision-making, leadership, and survival in high-pressure environments. At the same time, the myth-making process smoothed over elements of pain and tragedy. The chaos, fear, and uncertainty that defined so much of his daily life were often minimized in storytelling, replaced by narrative arcs that emphasized rise, skill, and eventual loss. This transformation made his story more compelling and digestible, while also preserving the cautionary elements necessary for cultural memory to function as teaching. The tension between reality and legend made Rich Porter a multidimensional figure, both human and archetypal. Rich's enduring presence in cultural memory also reflected the broader dynamics of Harlem itself. His life became a mirror for the neighborhood's own struggles and aspirations. People projected onto him their hopes for achievement, their fears of betrayal, and their understanding of survival. By occupying this symbolic space, Rich Porter's story extended beyond individual biography into collective identity, influencing how generations perceived the possibilities and perils of street life. The lasting impact of his story can also be seen in its resonance with later narratives in music, literature, and film. Filmmakers and writers often drew upon the framework of his life, rise, strategic mastery, betrayal, and untimely death, as a template for exploring similar themes. In these adaptations, the lines between biography and myth became increasingly fluid, allowing audiences to engage emotionally with the lessons of his life while appreciating the human complexities behind the legend. Ultimately, Rich Porter's presence in Harlem's cultural consciousness illustrates the interplay between reality and myth. He was a man who achieved extraordinary success under impossible circumstances, whose discipline and intelligence distinguished him from peers, and whose life was tragically cut short. In remembering him, the community preserved both the factual and symbolic dimensions of his story, its lessons, its cautions, and its inspiration. He became more than a historical figure, he became a narrative force, shaping how people understood ambition, loyalty, and survival in a world defined by risk and opportunity. Even decades later, his story remains relevant, continually reinterpreted in music, storytelling, and scholarship. Each retelling reinforces key themes: the importance of foresight, the fragility of trust, the cost of ambition, and the enduring impact of choices made under pressure. Harlem continues to remember him not only as a man who lived and died in the streets, but as a figure whose life, carefully observed and mythologized, provides insight into both individual and communal experience. In this way, Rich Porter transcended the limitations of biography to occupy a place in the ongoing story of a neighborhood, a culture, and a generation. Looking back at the life of Rich Porter, it becomes clear that his story is defined by contrasts, between ambition and caution, loyalty and betrayal, order and chaos. His rise from the streets of Harlem to a position of influence and power demonstrates both the potential of intelligence and discipline in environments shaped by scarcity, and the limits imposed by external pressures and human frailty. Examining these contrasts offers insight into the broader lessons of his life and the environment that produced him. From the outset, Rich's approach to life set him apart. Unlike many of his peers, who relied on impulsive action or brute force, he emphasized strategy and foresight. He observed patterns, anticipated outcomes, and valued consistency over momentary gains. This discipline allowed him to navigate the dangerous landscape of Harlem during the crack epidemic, where missteps could be fatal. Every decision he made carried calculated risk, yet he approached each with a level of composure that belied the volatility around him. This careful balance of ambition and restraint became the hallmark of his rise. His ability to maintain control was amplified by his understanding of human behavior. He recognized that loyalty, once earned, could be fragile, and that reputation mattered as much as currency. He cultivated trust deliberately, rewarding those who demonstrated reliability and removing or distancing those who could not be counted on. By doing so, he created a network that functioned with efficiency and mutual interest. This structure, built on both respect and fear, allowed him to operate effectively in a world that rewarded boldness but punished error harshly. Yet, even as his influence expanded, the very qualities that enabled his rise introduced vulnerabilities. Discipline and foresight could not prevent betrayal, nor could they shield him from the unpredictability of human ambition. His close partnership with Alpo Martinez, once a source of strength, ultimately became a conduit for his downfall. This illustrates a broader truth: even the most careful planning is subject to the variables of trust and human emotion. In environments where stakes are high, the most dangerous threats are often internal rather than external. Rich's story also highlights the psychological cost of power. Achieving and maintaining influence in Harlem demanded constant vigilance. Every decision, interaction, and transaction required careful calculation. Sleep, peace, and emotional ease were luxuries rarely afforded. Wealth provided comfort, but it could not protect against fear, isolation, or the knowledge that one's safety was contingent on both perception and control. The crown he wore, invisible yet heavy, brought authority but also unrelenting responsibility. The consequences of ambition are further complicated by the structural realities of Harlem during this period. Poverty, limited opportunity, and systemic neglect created an environment where traditional pathways to success were restricted. The streets offered an alternative, but it was fraught with risk. Rich Porter's life demonstrates how intelligence, strategy, and discipline could yield extraordinary achievement, yet also how these successes exist within a framework of ongoing vulnerability. His story reflects the interplay between individual agency and structural constraint, showing that achievement is possible but always precarious. One of the most profound lessons from Rich's life is the fragility of trust. The betrayal that led to his death was not born of sudden malice, but of cumulative pressure, ambition, and fear. The same qualities that bind partnerships together, loyalty, shared history, mutual dependence, can also unravel under stress. Trust is rarely absolute, and in environments defined by high stakes, even close bonds are vulnerable. Understanding this dynamic is crucial to interpreting both Rich Porter's personal narrative and the broader mechanics of survival and influence in Harlem's street economy. Rich's legacy is also inseparable from the way culture remembers him. Through storytelling, music, and communal memory, his life has been mythologized. Yet this myth does not erase the lessons of reality. Instead, it amplifies them, making them accessible to future generations. He is remembered not just for wealth or notoriety, but for discipline, strategic thinking, and the tragic consequences of trust breached. The interplay of fact and narrative ensures that his story serves as both cautionary tale and source of inspiration, offering insight into ambition, decision-making, and resilience. The contrasts that defined his life, control versus chaos, loyalty versus betrayal, discipline versus impulse, reflect broader truths about human experience. Power is seductive but isolating. Ambition is motivating but dangerous. Trust is necessary but fragile. Rich Porter's life illustrates that success in high-risk environments is never absolute, it is contingent, dynamic, and always subject to variables beyond individual control. These lessons extend beyond Harlem, offering insight into how environments shape decisions and how personal qualities interact with systemic pressures. Furthermore, his story demonstrates the complexity of morality in contexts defined by survival and scarcity. Actions that may appear ruthless or impulsive are often shaped by necessity, fear, or strategic calculation. Understanding Rich's decisions requires considering both the individual and the environment, recognizing that morality is frequently relative to circumstance. This nuance is essential to appreciating the depth of his experience and the challenges he navigated. Ultimately, Rich Porter's life invites reflection on the dual nature of success. He achieved extraordinary influence and commanded respect in a dangerous and volatile environment. Yet that same environment ensured that his position remained precarious. His story teaches that power, trust, and ambition are deeply intertwined, and that the forces enabling success can also accelerate vulnerability. His rise and fall are inseparable from the context in which he lived, a world shaped by scarcity, risk, and the delicate balance of human relationships. In contemplating his legacy, it becomes clear that Rich Porter's story is more than a biography, it is a meditation on the nature of ambition, trust, and resilience. His life exemplifies the potential for intelligence and discipline to navigate even the most unforgiving circumstances, while also highlighting the limits of control and the inevitability of human unpredictability. In reflecting on his rise and ruin, the lessons endure: vigilance, loyalty, and foresight are powerful tools, but they exist alongside forces that can never be fully mastered. The story of Rich Porter is, in essence, a reminder that greatness is fragile, trust is rare, and the pursuit of power always carries both promise and peril. Night settled over Harlem with a quiet, almost reverent stillness, as though the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The streets that had once hummed with the rhythm of life, the chatter of late-night corners, the soft thrum of distant music, the wheels of cars rolling slowly under flickering streetlights, now carried the weight of absence. Rich Porter's story had ended, but its echoes lingered in the bricks, in the shadows, in the memories of those who had watched him rise and fall. Harlem slept, yet the memory of what had transpired refused to rest, leaving the city suspended between the past and the lessons it had to offer. The passage of time did not soften the impact of his life or death. On the contrary, as weeks turned into months and months into years, the story of Rich Porter took on a quiet permanence. People remembered the young man who had navigated a dangerous world with intelligence and discipline, whose presence commanded respect and whose absence left a void that could never be filled. In telling his story repeatedly, whether to young men seeking guidance, to friends reflecting on what had been lost, or to curious listeners on street corners, the narrative became more than biography. It became legend, a thread woven into the fabric of Harlem's collective memory. Reflection on his life often began with contrasts. Rich had existed in extremes, the streets could be both opportunity and threat, wealth could bring admiration and isolation, trust could be a lifeline and a liability. He had walked these contradictions with skill, yet the very dynamics that enabled his rise also defined the terms of his fall. To understand him, one had to see both halves simultaneously, the disciplined operator who built systems of loyalty and order, and the human being vulnerable to the pressures, ambitions, and betrayals that inevitably shaped his world. The quiet moments in Harlem, the late nights when only the faint glow of streetlights illuminated empty sidewalks, served as a kind of reflection for the community. Those who had lived through the crack era, those who had watched Rich ascend, and those who had felt the impact of his absence all carried fragments of the story, often told in hushed voices. These recollections were not sensational, they were measured, blending admiration, grief, and reflection. Rich's life had been extraordinary, yes, but it had also been fragile, and that fragility was as important a lesson as any triumph. Harlem's landscape itself became a silent witness to his influence. The corners where he once maintained quiet order continued to bear his imprint in subtle ways, the respect that lingered, the behavior moderated by memory of his presence. Even as new figures rose to prominence, they moved in a space shaped by what Rich had established. His strategies, discipline, and approach to leadership left a legacy that persisted beyond his life, quietly influencing decisions, relationships, and power dynamics within the neighborhood. Cultural memory amplified his presence further. Hip-hop, literature, and storytelling preserved him as a figure of both inspiration and caution. Artists referenced his name to convey respect for intelligence, discipline, and strategic skill. Oral narratives highlighted lessons about loyalty, trust, and ambition. Through these channels, his story transcended the immediate neighborhood, becoming a part of a broader dialogue about street life, power, and survival. Even for those who never met him, Rich Porter became a symbol, someone whose life offered insight into the mechanics of influence and the consequences of human vulnerability. Yet despite the mythologizing, the human truths remained. Rich had been a man navigating a world where danger was constant, where every relationship carried potential risk, and where every decision could have permanent consequences. He had achieved remarkable success, but he had done so in a system that tolerated no error. The lessons of his life were grounded in this reality: discipline mattered, intelligence mattered, and foresight could only go so far when confronted with human unpredictability. For those who had been closest to him, the story carried additional layers of meaning. Grief was intertwined with reflection on shared experiences, on moments of trust, loyalty, and camaraderie. The bond he had shared with Alpo Martinez, once a source of strength, became a reference point for understanding both the power of relationships and the consequences of their fracture. These narratives emphasize the complexity of human behavior in high-stakes environments, highlighting both the potential and the limits of trust and ambition. The enduring appeal of Rich Porter's story lies in its universality, despite its specific context. It is a narrative about navigating risk, about balancing ambition with caution, and about the human consequences of power. Listeners, readers, and members of the community find in his life a lens through which to examine their own choices, relationships, and understanding of risk. The story persists not simply because of its drama, but because it carries lessons applicable across time and circumstance. As the night deepened and the streets of Harlem settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, there was a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had endured. Rich Porter's life, though cut short, left an indelible mark on the environment that had shaped him and on the community that had watched him navigate it. His decisions, his discipline, his ambitions, and ultimately the tragedy of his fall became a shared point of reference, a narrative guiding reflection on loyalty, power, and consequence. In the calm of late-night streets, where shadows stretch long and the city exhales in silence, the story of Rich Porter continues to resonate. It is a story of human potential and vulnerability, of the ways in which discipline and foresight can shape opportunity, and of the inevitability of forces beyond individual control. Harlem sleeps, but the lessons remain awake, etched into memory, culture, and collective consciousness. The city moves forward, as it always has, but it carries with it the quiet weight of his life, a reminder that power is temporary, trust is precious, and the stories of those who came before continue to shape the world around us. In this sense, Rich Porter's legacy is both temporal and eternal. He existed in a specific time and place, navigating a dangerous environment with skill and strategy. Yet his story transcends that moment, becoming part of the ongoing reflection on ambition, loyalty, and human choice. The streets of Harlem, which bore witness to his life and death, continue to teach these lessons, quietly and persistently, as generations pass through the spaces he once moved through with care and calculation. His story is at once a cautionary tale and a testament to the possibilities of human intelligence, discipline, and vision, a narrative that remains alive, even as the neighborhood itself sleeps, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and memory.